Hi, folks. This is Dr. Rob Sivas, the Carb Addiction Doc. And today we're going to discuss a very complex but heavily bastardized concept in the modern eating environment. We're going to talk about something that Americans call autophagy, that I grew up speaking English calling it autophagy. And it is a word that has come to represent something that it actually isn't. So there's a scientific and there's a colloquial expression of this. But if you're going to be healthy, especially when it comes to intermittent fasting, it is critical to understand the science behind that word and then how it's being used and perhaps even misused in the modern lay speak. The reason I like the English version, which is autophagy, is because it says what it means. Autophagy means eating of self. And eating of self is exactly what it is. So, first and foremost, if you look at a cell, and every cell in your body, almost every cell in your body, is basically its own unique entity. So, let's think of the cell almost like a whole human body. And the cell has a whole bunch of functions. It's got a whole bunch of organs. In the cell, we call them organelles. It's got a brain called the nucleus. It's got a way to reproduce, which is the DNA. It's got a way to feed itself, to break down energy. It's got a way to use certain messengers, hormones, that kind of thing. It is a complex system in and of itself. And then it also speaks, just like humans in a community, speaks to other cells. So one of the things that all human beings have, or most of us, have an intestinal tract. And the intestinal tract is designed to create poop, to get rid of waste material. And it is critically important to the successful function and survivability of cells that they have a way to get rid of cellular waste. And autophagy or autophagy is the way that the human cells or cells of any kind get rid of their waste products. And there are essentially three pathways. Think about our urine, think about maybe our sweat, and think about our poop, by which our cells get rid of waste. The first one is macroautophagy. And what the cells have inside of them are these little things called liposomes and or phagosomes. Phago means to eat, and these are little organelles that go around eating bits of dead and dying tissue in the cell. One of the powerhouses of the cell, in fact, where the power comes from, the factory of power is the mitochondria. That's where all the energy gets created. And those mitochondria are working really hard, but sometimes they get damaged and destroyed, and they're continuously being turned over in the cell. So that autophagosome isolates those mitochondria and chews them up and swallows them and puts them in this little package. And it's called a lysosome, and then that lysosome fuses with the cell membrane and basically ejects that material for recycling or for waste. So that's the macroautophagy. The microautophagy is where they're tiny little proteins that act as messengers, tiny little fractions within the cell, not real organs or organelles. But that is where this lysosome comes along and develops like a little cup. Plop, picks up that little piece of protein, puts it in the middle, and when that dirt bin, it's like a vacuum cleaner for the cell. When that vacuum cleaner gets full, it dumps its load outside of the cell. And then the coolest thing is what we call chaperone-mediated autophagy, which is where the cell actually produces little soldiers that go out and they collect and they bond with the debris. They actually form a connection. Just like the topical thing right now is COVID that bonds to a receptor. Well, you've got a receptor and a piece of garbage, and the chaperone is this receptor that bonds to the piece of garbage and carries that out. It's called a protein ligand or a protein bond. So it's protein that then binds that to the ligand, just like COVID. You see those little red spikes on COVID. Everybody's aware of this. This chaperone binds the piece of dirt to the membrane of the little liposome and evicts the debris that way. So autophagy is actually about getting rid of debris from within the cell as it does its work, so it can continue to be healthy and not poisoned by that debris. Can you imagine if you have a bowel obstruction, your gut is blocked, and all that poop and everything stagnates and it gets into your bloodstream and makes you really sick? Well, that's what happens to cells that don't have that. So autophagy is a natural, normally occurring, protective cellular process that is happening all the time and ensures cellular survival. The other thing that happens for certain cells, our immune cells, for example, is those immune cells are like little soldier cells that go around our body, and if they encounter a virus or a bacteria, they go to war with that virus, and sometimes they eat up that bacteria, or they eat up that virus, or they eat up that harmful antigen, and they swallow it up, and they isolate it in these liposomes, and they carry it there and then expel it. But sometimes that doesn't work. When your body's, let's say I get a cut and I get bacteria in my cut and my white cells are going crazy and they're swallowing up these bacteria, but the bacterial load for those cells is so big that autophagy can't happen. They can't isolate and eat those things. And it's actually called xenophagy, the eating of foreign, which is where bacteria, viruses, other pathogens get eaten by these cells. They can't package them and it leads to the death of the cell. That's pus. Pus is a bunch of dead cells that weren't able to have a healthy autophagy or autophagy process. So what triggers autophagy? Well, inflammation. So there's this balance between autophagy and inflammation, and healthy cells use inflammation and inflammatory processes to create enough of a foreign material or a foreign signal in the debris in the cell that the cell actually recognizes it as garbage and can swallow it up and remove it. So there's this continuous cycle between cells that induce inflammation to help them to get rid of bad or old tissue. And that's the way the body is supposed to function, this gentle vibration of inflammation and removal of tissue. And that inflammation is mediated in large part by fatty acid oxidation. Now, what does that mean? Well, every cell has a membrane and it's got fatty acids in it. And the fatty acids, some of them have double bonds which break, and they release active cytokines. They release peroxide and oxygen free radicals, and free radicals trigger that inflammatory response. And then that signals damage, and along comes the autophagy unit and gets rid of that. But that's in a very carefully, tightly balanced system. Now let's look at what we're doing to disturb that system. In the modern standard American diet, we're eating a ton of sugar, which is creating a lot of pro-inflammatory fat, and we're not eating enough of the saturated anti-inflammatory fat. So now we're swaying this gentle autophagy inflammation, very, very stable relationship. We're swaying that very heavily towards the inflammatory side. So all these normal products of the cell are becoming increasingly inflamed, becoming increasingly destroyed. And we're, by that excessive inflammation in the cell, we're creating more and more poop, more and more debris. And guess what the driver of that inflammatory response is? Insulin and insulin resistance. See how this all ties into our diet? So on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, we're triggering insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is directly related to our inflammatory cycle. And it is so important to understand that, because the little complex that insulin, the receptor for insulin, is something called the mTOR kinase receptor. And it's an insulin sensitive receptor. And the mTOR process triggers inflammation and triggers some of these autophagy changes. So there's this delicate balance between inflammation mediated by insulin, mediated by sugar, mediated by saturated fat that helps with the removal of harmful things. But if that goes excessive, then our cells kind of go ballistic, chewing themselves up. So autophagy becomes rampant. You start eating yourself. Why is that important? And this is so important to understand, because when the immune cells have this excessive inflammation-mediated, insulin-mediated autophagy response that is overwhelming, they start acting against parts of the tissue. They start seeing parts of the normal human cellular tissue as being foreign, and they chew it up and they react to it. And then they cross-react to other parts of human tissue that shouldn't be attacked. So because of this inflammatory response, our immune cells tend to see things that are natural human parts of a cell as being foreign. And they have this antibody-mediated response, this antigen-mediated response, and they over-attack what now looks foreign to them but is actually normal. And ladies and gentlemen, that is called autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease. And it can happen in the intestine. That's why we get irritable bowel syndrome, ulcerative colitis. And the most important one is Crohn's disease. And there's a whole separate section that I'm going to do, a whole separate talk on Crohn's disease. But it includes antibodies against your thyroid, antibodies against your insulin-producing cells, type 1 diabetes, or LADA, the latent autoimmune diabetes of adulthood. It includes rheumatoid arthritis. It includes some of the Parkinson's-like diseases. It includes cancers. All of those things are heightened because inflammation pushes autophagy to start chewing yourself. So cells lose the ability to die, which is called cancer. Cells destroy excessive amounts of inflamed fatty acid, particularly in the brain, and that's called Parkinson's or dementia, or part of the Alzheimer's process. That inflammatory reaction is part of the Alzheimer's process. Those are all parts of the autophagy spectrum. And the place where it goes awry, triggered by inflammation, triggered by insulin, is to chew up itself in excess. It's no longer a balanced response. It is completely toward anti-human. It's chewing us up. And the way to correct that massive autoimmune response is to calm down inflammation. And the way you control inflammation is by controlling insulin, by becoming insulin sensitive. And the way we become insulin sensitive is not to trigger insulin resistance by chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. So if you get rid of carbohydrates, that's one way to bring that insulin sensitivity back, to restore insulin sensitivity, get rid of insulin resistance, reduce the pressure on the mTOR kinase gene that's driving the autophagy. And the second thing is to eat healthy fat, saturated fat, 3-omega fatty acids, cholesterol, that build a healthy cell membrane and organelle membrane that is anti-inflammatory. So if we reduce inflammation, we reduce autoimmune disease. That's why it is reversible. Not immediately, but over time. And that's why you see people with Hashimoto's disease, the common cause of hypothyroidism, that affects every cell in the body. But that is reversible. You can put your Hashimoto's into remission. And we now know that Crohn's disease, for example, is an autoimmune disease triggered by a particular type of bacteria in the gut. Well, you can get rid of the bacteria, or you can change the environment under which that bacteria lives, and you can put Crohn's disease into remission. So think about that, folks. Chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, a high carbohydrate, low fat, low saturated fat diet, high in polyunsaturated fat, which is called the standard American diet, the food pyramid, 1977, that is actually the pro-inflammatory diet. And that, folks, is what autophagy is about. Now, where has it been bastardized to a certain extent? Autophagy has been used also to simulate weight loss, and that's not true. Weight loss is about burning fat and accessing and burning your fat. That's not autophagy. That's not the body eating itself. That's the body just using excess stores. So we should not use autophagy as part of intermittent fasting, as part of weight loss. It is all about inflammation. And intermittent fasting does help because you're not getting in those carbohydrates. So you're automatically starting to use your fat. But a low carb, high fat diet that is built around IF, intermittent fasting, is the ideal human diet, and it quietens down the inflammatory response. And inflammation and the consequences of inflammation is by far the largest source of human misery and human disease. Deal with your inflammation, you're dealing with your life. Low carb, high fat, reduction in inflammation. You can take all the pills you want to as anti-inflammatories. They ain't going to work. You can't fight against thunder. But getting rid of the triggers of inflammation, allowing autophagy to occur naturally in balance, and I hate that word balance, but where inflammation is healthy rather than unhealthy, overwhelming. You get rid of autoimmune disease, you will be so much healthier in diseases that we haven't even yet understood or described. Stay healthy, my friends. No carbs, lots of saturated fat. Control your inflammatory response. Good luck out there.